Welcome to this episode of Sexpertease. I'm your host and favorite sexpert, the Erica Rivera. Today we're talking about two foundational pillars of healthy relationships, and that's boundaries and consent. As we conclude Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we're taking a proactive look at building strong and respectful relationships based on mutual understanding. Healthy relationships allow both people to feel safe and valued and free to express themselves. In this episode, we'll explore what boundaries are, how to establish them, and why consent is so crucial for true intimacy. So, what exactly makes a relationship healthy? Let's start with the basics. A healthy relationship is built on mutual respect, trust, and open communication. In a healthy relationship, both partners feel valued and safe and able to express their needs and boundaries. It's about feeling secure enough to be yourself without fear of judgment or backlash. These elements are the bedrock for a relationship that allows each person to thrive. So, that being said, the first pillar that we're going to talk about is boundaries. So, boundaries are essential for maintaining individuality and emotional health in relationships. They define what we're comfortable with and they establish our personal limits. Boundaries aren't just physical. They can be more than that. They can be emotional, they can be sexual, they can even be digital. It's basically a way to communicate our needs and protect our well being within a relationship. Now, why are boundaries important? Boundaries create safety in relationships. That is the biggest part. When we know our limits are respected, when we know our limits are respected, that's truly when we feel safe enough to be vulnerable. Boundaries can also foster respect when both partners communicate their limits clearly. There's less chance for misunderstandings. Boundaries make it clear where each person stands, which strengthens trust and openness. But how exactly do we establish those boundaries? It takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of practice. You may still be practicing how to make your boundaries clear today. Start by being specific. Start by being clear and specifically define what makes you comfortable or uncomfortable. Use I statements like I feel comfortable when dot 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 or I feel uncomfortable when dot dot dot. This keeps the conversation focused on your needs rather than sounding accusatory. And remember to listen. Healthy boundaries require active listening from both sides. Now, there's also a lot of common misconceptions about boundaries, and I want to clear some of that up. Let's clear up some common myths. First of all, setting boundaries isn't selfish. You may hear some people say that it is. It's not selfish at all. It's a necessary part of self care and healthy interaction. Another myth is that boundaries create distance. Totally a myth. In reality, they foster a closer and healthier connection. Makes sense, right? Finally, some believe that boundaries aren't needed in close relationships. But the truth is, boundaries are essential for maintaining trust and respect at any level of closeness. So if you ever hear any of those myths, ignore them. Boundaries are necessary. Now, there are different types of boundaries. They come in many forms. Physical boundaries, they normally define like your personal space and preferences for touch. Emotional boundaries involve sharing feelings at a comfortable pace. Okay, keep that in mind because I don't think that's a common one that we talk about. We do talk about physical boundaries a lot. Don't touch me, don't hug me, that sort of thing. But there are also emotional boundaries. You don't have to pursue certain emotional conversations if you don't want to, and you can set the tone and the pace for those emotions to be expressed or take place. There's also sexual boundaries. Sexual boundaries establish comfort with intimacy and sexual activities, always relying on consent. And we also have digital boundaries, which might involve privacy in online interactions or social media use, especially in today's day and age where we're all on social media. There's so many platforms that we are a part of. And so there is such thing as digital boundaries as well. Each type of boundary contributes to the overall health of the relationship. The other huge pillar when it comes to healthy relationships, and you've probably heard me talk about this quite often, is consent. Consent is one of the most important aspects of any relationship, especially in intimate contexts. It's basically a mutual agreement where both partners willingly say yes to an activity. Willingly say yes to an activity. True consent is enthusiastic, freely given, and never pressured. So if it's not enthusiastic, not freely given, and pressured, then truly there isn't consent there. Without consent, intimacy can't be truly healthy or respectful. And just like boundaries, understanding boundaries and having the ability to set boundaries, practicing consent in relationships also is a thing. Practicing. So practicing consent means making it a part of your everyday interactions. Ask. I say this actually in my own personal relationships all the time. Ask, don't assume. Always ask. It doesn't matter how small or how big the activity, or it just doesn't matter. Ask. So ask before initiating an activity, even if it's something like hugging. And also make sure to respect no. Respect the word no because it's important to honor your partner's boundaries. Checking in regularly is also helpful, especially in long-term relationships where consent can sometimes be taken for granted. Some of you are probably nodding right now. That might be something that is relatable. When you're with someone for a really long time, sometimes that consent can be taken for granted, and we forget to check in, we forget to ask, we don't necessarily get into that habit anymore of considering that person's boundaries when you should. You should always. Now, let's try to better understand this concept of enthusiastic consent. Enthusiastic consent is the gold standard. It means that both people actively and happily Keywords: actively and happily agree to engage in an activity. There's no reluctance or hesitation. Enthusiasm in consent ensures that both people, both or more people, feel genuinely comfortable and excited, which is key to fostering a healthy and intimate connection. And, this month, because it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we have focused a lot on how to pretty much call out red flags in relationships. If you have watched the other episodes leading to today, we've talked about coercive control and different types of signs of when you might be abused. So one thing I want to touch base on, even though today's episode is a little bit lighter, in talking about boundaries, consent, and how to have healthy relationships, it's still important to recognize the violations of consent. Sometimes consent is violated in ways that may not seem obvious. For example, pressuring or guilt tripping someone into saying yes compromises consent. Ignoring or dismissing boundaries is also a violation. So, recognizing these behaviors helps us understand what true consent looks like and when it's being compromised. Before I go on to my next slide, and not to go kind of dark right now, but I have encountered couples in my office or video chat, however they choose to do their session. But I have encountered situations where I might be talking to a partner and they don't feel like they're being abused because it's their husband or it's their wife. For some reason, we tend to think that if you're being abused by like a stranger in, I don't know, in a dark alley. But that's not the case. A lot of times, a lot of abuse takes place with people that are the closest to us. And yes, that can include your wife or your husband. So in this case, when I talk about consent being violated and it not being too obvious, being pressured, being guilt tripped, being coerced into saying yes is still a violation, even if it's someone you're married to. So keep that in mind. It doesn't make it right just because you're married to this individual. Um, if someone is trying to convince you to say yes, trying to talk you into saying yes, that is still a violation. If later you decide to say yes because such person coerced you and it wasn't enthusiastic consent, you are still being violated. Like, let's make that clear. Consent is not ongoing as well. Consent is something that can change. So you may agree to an activity, and then later you may change that and say no. And it's still that person's responsibility to respect that boundary and to respect that no. So consent is not, oh, well, you already said it's okay, and therefore it is ongoing forever, all the time. No, that's not how it works. So I just felt it was really important to say that before going on to my next slide, which I want to also talk about communication. How do you communicate boundaries and consent? Healthy communication is essential for navigating boundaries and consent. Being open and honest without fear of judgment creates that safe space for both partners. And I said it earlier, but I'll say it again, listening actively. That is a big part of boundaries and consent. It's not just communicating or just talking or just making sure, that I get what I need across. No, it's also listening actively and using positive language, like saying what you're comfortable with rather than just what you're against. It helps keep the conversation constructive, because I feel like too, when we talk about boundaries, it's always it's always in such a negative connotation, or, we're very, very hard pressed about what we're against. And, you know, that may not be as easy of a conversation to have with the listening partner. If you're keeping that positive language going, like, hey, I really like it when this happens, or I'm very comfortable when we do this, or, you know, talking more so about the things that you are comfortable with keeps that conversation productive while still establishing your boundaries. So I know that there are still some situations where there is a challenge in setting those boundaries, or perhaps you're a people pleaser that has a really hard time setting boundaries. It can be challenging, especially if you're worried about conflict or rejection. Maybe you're someone that doesn't like conflict, doesn't like confrontation. And remember, it is totally natural to feel nervous, but it is super important that you set boundaries. Boundaries are about respecting yourself as well as your partner. And overcoming these fears, they take practice, but it'll benefit a healthy relationship. It'll make the benefits of that relationship worthwhile. At times when you think by not setting boundaries, by being a people pleaser, by doing those things, you may think you're benefiting the relationship, but you're actually doing the relationship a disservice by not having that respect for you or your partner. So there are a lot of resources out there, in addition, of course, to tuning into Sexpertease. Thank you so much for that. Of course, I'm going to keep dishing out as much information as possible on this show, but I also feel like it is my duty to make sure that there are further resources out there to help you learn more and more about healthy relationships. One is loveisrespect.org. So, loveisrespect.org offers guidance on setting boundaries and recognizing unhealthy dynamics. So, if you're that person that I was speaking to earlier, maybe you're a people pleaser, you don't like conflict, you don't want rejection, maybe checking out a website like loveisrespect.org. There's some guidance there where you can learn how to set those boundaries a little bit more effectively. If you're someone who isn't very good at pinpointing some of those red flags, this is another resource for that. It'll help you recognize some of those unhealthy dynamics. Also, RAIN. RAIN provides resources on consent and support for those affected by boundary violations. So, RAIN is also a resource I've spoken about in previous episodes. If you're someone that has been affected by sexual assault, any type of sexual violence, domestic violence, rape, incest, RAIN is a huge, huge resource for support. And also the Gottman Institute. They have excellent tools for building lasting and respectful relationships. So please don't hesitate to explore these resources. In closing, boundaries and consent are essential. I mean, I hope that we were all able to gather that from today. So it is essential for building a healthy and respectful relationship. By educating ourselves, watching this show is considered educating yourself, communicating openly, and also respecting each other's limits. Those are the foundations of strong partnerships. And I really do encourage each of you to practice these skills in your relationships and to continue learning about ways to create safer and more empowering connections. I get it. I've had a couple comments here and there about my episodes currently not being super spicy. And they're not at the moment. But please remember, every episode is geared towards healthy relationships. In order to have a great sex life, you have to have boundaries set and enthusiastic consent. In order to have a great sex life, you definitely don't want abuse to be involved. You don't want DV, SV, some of the things that I've mentioned in these last few episodes are still very important in creating those intimate connections. Really hard to get in the mood if you didn't consent to something. Really hard to get in the mood if your boundaries are constantly being stepped on. Very hard to get in the mood if you're going through coercive control. You know what I mean? And if you're, like I said, if you're in a marriage as well, it's still possible to have some of those unhealthy dynamics. So it's important to be able to pinpoint them out and nip them right then and there. Make sure that you're communicating with your partner and working on those connections. I think that it's okay to be fearful of rejection, fearful of, what the consequence could be for setting a boundary, but understand that it's important to set those boundaries for a long lasting, happy, healthy relationship. It really goes a long way in the end for both of you. So I really hope that you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for joining me. For more resources, feel free to visit me online. So my website is theericarivera.com, but you can also email me, Sexpertease at e360tvlive.com. And I've also included some information about our nonprofit, National Care Foundation, where we do provide support services for survivors of trauma. And remember, respect and trust. If you got anything else out of this episode, remember that respect and trust are the keys to a healthy, intimate relationship. Stay informed, stay curious, and I will see you next time.